Whichever term is used, all these terms have the same definition, namely the relocation of a deep subgingival cavity margin with the help of a composite filling using the matrix technique. Any practitioner can easily see the advantages of this approach. Of course, with a coronal epigingival crown margin, it is much easier to make an impression or a digital scan. And the subsequent adhesive cementation of the indirect restoration is much easier to perform without contamination. Of course, placing a filling with deep proximal boxes is always a clinical challenge, and especially with this procedure of deep margin elevation, the quality of the proximal filling margins is of the utmost importance for the success of the entire treatment. Factors influencing the quality of seal of the proximal filling are the quality of the existing tooth structure and its ability to build up an adhesive bond. Let's first look at the substances involved. Usually we have dentin in such deep subgingival cavities or even root cement. There is usually no enamel in these regions. It is generally known that the adhesion to etched enamel is very efficient and stable, but the adhesion to dentin, on the other hand, can be influenced by various factors. On the one hand, there is the morphology of the dentin, and on the other hand, the type of adhesive used. And of course, there is always the sensitivity of the adhesive cementation procedure. The declared aim is to have a filling in the proximal box that is absolutely margin tight, and of course we need a contamination-free and clean cavity for this in order to be able to guarantee a secure adhesive bond of the filling material. In order to achieve this goal, we have various tools at our disposal that we are all familiar with. On the one hand, there is the rubber dam, although in some cases it might be more difficult to place a rubber dam adequately so that it actually leads to a secure seal. The aid of a ligature should be mentioned here, and matrix technology in any case is very important. Of course, with the help of a matrix, the marginal cavity floor can be sealed really well with the aid of a wedge because no contact with the neighboring tooth has to be achieved. Evidence-based dentistry is subject to progress and change, and we will all still remember that there were times when it was clearly stated that indirect restorations should only have ever dentin or enamel as a boundary. They should under no circumstances end in build-up fillings. Against this historical background, the question naturally arises: is this procedure, which has been described so far, allowed at all? Is it state-of-the-art, and is it evidence-based dentistry? And if so, how exactly? With which material? And what are the framework conditions for this treatment to be carried out? These are questions that we will now clarify. Fortunately for us, there is already a lot of literature on this question and also a large amount of reviewable work. Here it could be shown that the deep margin elevation has no influence on the fatigue behavior and the fracture resistance of the indirect restoration. It does not influence the failure rate of indirect restoration or the repairability, regardless of the restorative material used. The procedure is not influenced by the composite material chosen or by the structure of the supra-construction, whether it is an inlay, an onlay, or even an endocrown. Vertoli et al. Were able to show that deep margin elevation even has a positive effect on the fracture rate of ceramic inlays. Adhesive bonding to enamel or composite surfaces after deep marginal elevation resulted in a significantly lower fracture rate compared to bonding to cementitious walls. There is no evidence that deep margin elevation leads to a reduction in bond strength between the proximal box, regardless of the choice of composite and regardless of the etching procedure selected. Defects were more likely to occur in the bond between dentin and composite than in the bond between composite and restoration. There is another review that clearly shows that deep margin elevation is state of the art. It was shown that the marginal quality in direct restorations is not significantly influenced by the use of deep margin elevation. It was also shown that the viscosity of the composite used is not decisive for the quality of the margins. Another finding from this review is that the increment technique leads to better results and is recommended. Therefore, the type of composite used for deep margin elevation does not seem to have any influence on the quality of the marginal seal nor the quality of the bond between the composite and the ceramic. Let us now shed some light on which material is preferred for the indirect restoration after performing the deep marginal elevation. In a study here, it was investigated whether the marginal seal between deep margin elevation and composite-based indirect restoration shows a difference compared to the use of classical ceramic restorations. In this study, it was shown that the marginal seal between a composite-based material and the composite surface after deep margin elevation was particularly high in a very high proportion of the marginal sections considered. A classical ceramic restoration showed a high tightness in the marginal seal to the composite surface in significantly fewer proportions. This study also showed that composite-based indirect restorative materials have a higher marginal seal to root dentin or root cement than a classic ceramic inlay, even without previous deep margin elevation. To summarize, this study clearly demonstrated that the best marginal quality could be achieved between deep margin elevation and composite-based inlay materials. It was clearly shown that the marginal quality between the composite-based inlays and deep margin elevation surfaces was significantly better than the marginal quality between ceramic inlays without deep margin elevation in deep subgingival cavities. There is another study where the marginal quality between lava ultimate inlays with and without deep margin elevation was investigated. It was shown that there was no difference in marginal quality between dentin and proximal box elevation. From these results, it can be concluded that the best marginal quality can be achieved between composite-based indirect restoration and deep margin elevation. Composite-based materials are the materials that work best together with deep margin elevation. Now we are still dealing with the question of which material is best for direct restoration. In the study shown here, it was investigated whether there is a difference in the application of a conventional and a flowable composite, and it was clearly shown that there is no difference. What requirements must the proximal filling fulfill in the context of deep margin elevation? This was examined in the present study, and it was found that a maximum increment thickness of 1 millimeter with a total layer thickness of 3 millimeters leads to a significantly better marginal qualities than only one increment with a thickness of 3 millimeters. Therefore, the practical conclusion can be drawn that the maximum increment thickness for the approximal filling should be 1 millimeter. This study was also carried out in combination with classical ceramic inlays and showed the same result, that the increment thickness should not exceed 1 millimeter. To summarize, it can be emphasized here once again that a composite of choice can be used for performing deep margin elevation. This can be a conventional filling composite as well as a flowable material. The only thing to keep in mind is that the increment thickness should not exceed 1 millimeter. When choosing indirect restoration, composite-based materials are clearly to be preferred. Let's move on to the practical clinical procedure and some material recommendations. Here again, as a reminder, the practical challenge is actually to achieve a good marginal seal of the deep subgingival cavity margins so that we do not have any steps and also no marginal leakage. In the practical approach, it now looks like a combination of the previously mentioned procedures: deep margin elevation, immediate dentin sealing, and cavity design optimization. These usually take place, of course, when adapted to the clinical circumstances in each case. The first step is always the defect-orientated preparation and excavation. It is at this point that the enamel margins are defined and the preparation shape is also determined. For this, we refer to the tooth preparation module, where there are some instructions on the preparation shape. It is important to check already at this stage how much shape is necessary for the later indirect restoration, and to keep in mind that we should aim for a minimum occlusal thickness of about 1.5 millimeter. Of course, we have to bear in mind that this restoration thickness can still be maintained, for example, after applying composite in the course of cavity optimization. Once the preparation shape has been determined so far, and the caries have been excavated, the proximal cavity can be sealed with the matrix technique. The entire cavity cleaned and the bonding protocol carried out accordingly. Immediate dentin sealing together with cavity design optimization under use of a universal adhesive. Finally, the adhesive composite is applied in deep margin elevation, and at the same time the entire dentin surface is covered in cavity design optimization. Now we will show the practical workflow again using some clinical images. Here we see the defect-orientated preparation and excavation. The enamel boundaries are sounded out and defined so that we already have an approximate idea of the latter restoration and preparation shape at this point. The space requirement is checked. We need at least 1.5 millimeter of occlusal. Once we have defined the preparation margins and rough preparation shape, the approximal filling can be done. This is done using the matrix technique. Either partial bend matrices or, for example, the Toffelmeier matrix system are available. It is important at this point that the marginal cavity edge and the subgingival cavity edge are actually sealed extremely well by the matrix. Contrary to conventional filling therapy, the approximal contact to the neighboring tooth is of course unimportant and does not have to be taken into account. For this reason, we can also recommend sealing with Teflon tape. For example, this can be then compressed between the matrix and the neighboring tooth so that there is no sufficient approximal contact later on, which is not needed in this case. And so it is easier to really seal the marginal edge and the deep subgingival cavity edge adequately. Here in the picture, we show the Palodent V3 matrix system as an example of a partial band matrix system, or the classical Toffelmeier matrices. When the matrix has been applied sufficiently and the margin sealed, the cavity can be cleaned once again before the next step, that is, before the further bonding protocol. Different procedures are available for this. It can be done classically with pumice powder, but can also be done with katana cleaner. Katana cleaner is approved for intraoral cleaning and contains special MDP salts. The advantage of katana cleaner is that saliva proteins, which can jeopardize the adhesive bond to composites, are actually completely removed by this liquid. This leads to a better adhesive bond, and the application is quite easy. Simply massage katana cleaner onto the tooth surface with a foam palette or brush for about 10 seconds and then spray off thoroughly with plenty of water spray. After etching dentin, make sure that the dentin is not over dried. In the further course of the bonding protocol, the dentin is now conditioned with the help of a universal adhesive. This is massaged onto the dentin for the specified time according to the manufacturer's instructions and then dried with a sufficient airflow. Make sure that no lakes remain and then light cure the universal adhesive. As a material for universal adhesives, we can recommend prime and bond at this point. This material must be massaged onto the dentin for 20 seconds, then blown and light cured for 20 seconds. There are several alternatives, such as Clear Fill Universal Bond Quick from Kuraray Noritaka or the Adhese Universal from Ivoclar Vivadent. The advantage of Clear Fill Universal Bond Quick is that no reaction time is required. This universal adhesive simply has to be applied to the dentin, briefly massaged in, and can then be blown and light cured without any time being specified. DME Slide 33. Following the conditioning of the dentin, the composite material of choice can now be placed in the proximal boxes. A maximum increment thickness of 1 mm must be observed. The individual increments are light cured. When the proximal box is completely filled, the entire dentin surface is covered as part of the cavity design optimization. A material of choice can be selected as the composite material. Care should be taken to follow the manufacturer's instructions. For example, SDR Flow Plus from Dentsply Sirona, in conjunction with Prime and Bond Active, is a good choice here. Clearfill Majesty ES Flow from Kuraray Noritaka, in conjunction with Clearfill Universal Bond Quick, is also a good alternative. Of course, the composite material of your choice can be used at this point. You are free to decide. After the final step of cavity design optimization by applying the composite to the entire dentin surface, finish the preparation. It is important not to leave any sharp corners or edges inside the cavity. It is also important that only dentin has been covered by the composite. Any enamel margins that may be present should be finished again and thoroughly cleaned of any adhesive and composite residue. As a result, we now have a clean cavity. The dentin is already protected at this point by the applied composite, and we can achieve an even thickness of the indirect restoration by applying this composite layer. At the very end of our workflow, we check the preparation shape again and check the enamel margins for a clean preparation margin. Check the insertion direction of the restoration. We would like to point out once again that the proximal contacts of the neighboring teeth should be ideally designed in order to make the subsequent insertion of the restoration easy and possible.